I'm afraid I don't have any slides, so you're just going to have to listen to me. And what I do is I tell stories, but I'm going to build on whatever's been presented already very competently by my fellow speakers. The first story I'm going to tell you about is how Bangladesh as a country dealt with the influx of the Rohingyas over the last year and a half or 2 years. And you've heard a lot about it in the political context. I'll tell you about it in the environmental context. And for each of the environmental problems, I will tell you what we've tried to do. Now, this is a wicked problem, so there are no solutions for anything. Every problem, every solution has problems associated with the solution. Okay, so there are no clean solutions, but we have tried to do what we can. And this, to me, is really a credit to the people of Bangladesh, from the government to the NGOs who are working there, to anybody who's working in that region, the local population included. So number one, these refugees came across the border and they were given a place to stay, which was a forest area. Several thousand hectares of traditional forest. It was an area where wild elephants roam. They come up and down from north to south, from Bangladesh to Myanmar and back. We built the refugee shelters across the elephant path. And initially, some of the elephants actually trampled over some of the huts and killed a few people. But then after that, Bangladesh government, UCL and others, have built a series of elephant towers around the camp, and they give warnings to the elephants to go around instead of come through the camp. And that's been very, very successful. Now what the next thing they're trying to do is to see whether they can give corridors for those elephants to come through and not trample through the camps. But we built the camps on the elephant trails without knowing that we were doing so. The second problem we had, the devastation of the forest of the thousands of hectares I mentioned already, was that people needed firewood and went to the forest to collect firewood and were increasing the pressure on the biodiversity and the forest outside the camp, so the remaining forest. And that was quite severe. There was quite a lot of biodiversity loss and firewood through firewood collection. I should say, by the way, that the information I'm sharing with you is based on a year-long study that my center did along with a number of experts from different institutions in Bangladesh that was commissioned by the International Organization of Migration to assess the environmental problems and then recommend solutions or at least some ways of mitigating the environmental impact. So what I'm mentioning to you is both the problem and some of the mitigation actions that came out of that. So on the biodiversity loss for firewood, the solution, which is quite an expensive solution, but is something that is now being implemented at scale, is to provide them with LPG. They are being given gas to cook, either in the homestead or collectively in groups together, and that is now being provided to the refugees in quite a large scale. And therefore they don't have to go out and cut trees or get roots from some of the trees. Some of the areas have been totally devastated because they had to forage and get whatever firewood they could. And then one of the other amelioration or mitigating activities that has taken place now and is actually again being scaled up is replanting trees, both within the camps themselves, wherever possible. Many of the NGOs who are working there are planting trees, and these are now growing. They're also replanting with the forest department in the surrounding area that the camps are in. The camps are in the middle of forest, so the forest around them has to be replenished or regenerated. The other aspect that was a major problem was water, drinking water supply. We dug lots of tube wells to get groundwater for them. Sometimes we did them in contaminated areas, sometimes we did them too close together. We needed to look at where were the best aquifers available, where were we able to get good clean drinking water to supply to people and to provide that. And over time, that particular issue of supplying drinking water through provision from groundwater has now been more or less solved, and we've got enough tube wells around the camps to provide them with drinking water. But an associated problem with water is also sanitation. So both human fecal sludge sanitation and other kinds of pollution, plastic water bottles and other kinds of solid waste which accumulates in the camps, that has become a significant problem as well. And so one of the mitigation activities there on the fecal sludge management is that a number of NGOs like Practical Action and ActionAid and others have set up quite good state-of-the-art fecal sludge management systems in different parts of the camps that are collecting these collective toilets. The sludge is collected in the sludge management, and they are then being able to recycle them in a very sanitary manner, with the local people and the Rohingyas being involved in doing this activity. On the solid waste management, we haven't done as well, but we are trying to develop systems for collection of the solid waste and then disposal of the solid waste outside the camps, potentially in Bazar, in the town. They're trying to build a solid waste management center or system there to take it to them. We're still working on that. I'd say that's much more of a work in progress. The other element that we looked at was air pollution, and there's a significant amount of air pollution both outside the camps, because a lot more vehicles are coming and going in that area now. All the aid workers come in the morning, there's a huge traffic jam, and then in the evening when they leave the camps and come back again to Cox's Bazar, another traffic jam. And then inside, as I said, particularly when they were burning firewood inside to cook, there's a significant increase in particulate matter for people inside the house, particularly the women. And so this provision of LPG has helped that to some extent. So we're trying to monitor the air pollution. It can be a significant problem, and we're trying to find ways of dealing with it. One of the major problems that we identified at the very beginning, just before the monsoon, which you heard about from Dr. Kamal, was the potential for landslides. These are very light huts built on hills, and any significant downpour of rain causes the land to slide in those areas, and there were some initial landslides that caused some fatalities of people. But as you heard, we did our scientists and Bangladeshis and others did some very, very good mapping of the most vulnerable areas where the landslides are most likely. We relocated from the most vulnerable areas some of the households to less vulnerable, but there are variations in how vulnerable the place is. And for those who are still vulnerable, they were provided with extra rope and extra materials to batten down the hatches so that the houses could be better protected. Or not call them houses, they're more like huts. Could be better protected during the heavy rainfall. And then finally also making channels for the water to flow down and not make the huts flow down with them. And that actually was quite successful. So the last monsoon period that we had, there were very few fatalities from landslides. There was one household of 4 that unfortunately died, but other than them, there were no more fatalities. There were quite a few heavy rain downpour events, but we didn't have the fatalities that we could have had we not been prepared for that. The one big thing that we are still not prepared for, we've done a lot of capacity building in terms of letting people know what to do. We have Bangladesh as one of the best cyclone protection and warning systems in the world for most parts of the country, but not for the Rohingya region. We don't have cyclone shelters there. But what we have done is to tell people what to do during a cyclone. People are aware of what they need to do, where they can go there. There are now structures built that are not cyclone shelters, but there are structures where protection can be taken. People can go and stay during the warnings. And so even though we don't have cyclone shelters there, we hope that even if there is a cyclone that hits that particular area, it will not be as devastating as it might otherwise be. So the bottom line for this story is to tell you that what can be done is being done. And it's a combination of Bangladeshi experts, Bangladeshi government, Bangladeshi NGOs, international community, IOM, UNHCR, you name an NGO and they're all there, working there. There are thousands of international expats working in Cox's Bazar, and the Rohingya refugees themselves. And one of the important elements that I'd like to highlight here, which Saiful has just presented very eloquently, is that originally we used to it was a humanitarian crisis, an immediate environmental crisis, and we had to meet the crisis. The crisis is over. They've been there for a year now, we've managed the crisis. Now it's a slightly longer term problem that's not just humanitarian anymore. And in that longer term problem, we now have an additional issue which wasn't there before, which is climate change. In fact, Bangladesh is well known, and my area of specialization is climate change. Bangladesh is well known as one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. And we had a very recent analysis of where the most vulnerable hotspots in the country were. And we identified 5 of them. The low-lying coastal area, we saw the map, the southwestern part of Bangladesh, but the cycle just showed. The riverine flood-prone areas, the northwest of the country, which is a drought-prone area called the Barin, and our major cities like Dhaka and Chittagong that are prone to heavy rainfall flooding. The Cox's Bazar region is not one of the hotspots. But if we did that study today, then Cox's Bazar would, in my view, be at least number 2 or number 3 because of the Rohingya refugee population there and the host population there have now become a very vulnerable to climate change population. And so we need to bring that factor in to our thinking about what we do. Whether they go to Bhasan Chor or they stay in Cox's Bazar or they go back to Myanmar even, this is really immaterial. We need to factor that fact into the plight of the refugees, Myanmar refugees in Bangladesh. And what that adds in the conversation, in my view, is in addition to it being a humanitarian crisis, a political crisis, a refugee or a genocide crisis, it's now a climate change crisis. So the world of the climate change decision makers need to be aware of that. They need to be told that there's a climate change refugee problem in Bangladesh. And incidentally, now that this has been raised, Bangladesh is not the only place where this is true. It's also true for the refugees in Syria, also true for the refugees in Uganda, also true for the refugees in South Sudan. Refugee populations tend to be placed in most vulnerable areas, and those areas are now being impacted by climate change as well. So climate change impacts on refugee populations, even though these are not climate migrants per se, they're political migrants, is nevertheless a new dimension that we need to take into account, and potentially an area to bring in either further financial assistance or at least political might come from the global community. So something that I'm particularly doing in the climate change arena, bringing this to their attention. And finally, let me just share a little bit of my own thinking on what we need to do, given that this is a highly political and, as I said, a wicked problem with no easy solutions, and we have to figure out what to do for ourselves and do what we can. But in that spirit of humanitarian acceptance of these people, looking after them that Bangladesh has already displayed, I think one of the things that we need to take into account going forward is the fact that the majority of these people are little children. That's an amazing fact. That's not true for many other refugee populations. Half of them are little kids. And we're putting them in schools. In fact, my daughter works for BRAC Education, who has 300 of these schools that are providing them with local level education. I think that is now our responsibility. Little kids are there. We are in loco parentis. We are their de facto parents. We are responsible for making them into good citizens. Whether we give them Bangladeshi citizenship or not doesn't really matter. We should make them good citizens, educate them, make them be able to get employment somewhere, do good work. I feel that now should be our overwhelming humanitarian feeling towards what are we going to do for them, with them, is look after the children. I think that to me is an overriding priority.